Hey, I get it when you're staring at a rack of specs and wondering if a 22-core, 192GB server is really worth the price. The hesitation is real. I was in the same spot last month, trying to convince myself that a single box could handle the mixed workload virtualization my small to medium business needed without turning my budget into a black hole. If you're wrestling with that decision, the link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's walk through why the HPE Proliant DL380 Gen 10 might be the right fit, and where it could end up being more hassle than help. First off, the DL380 isn't a toy. It's a 12-bay, 3.5-inch LFF chassis built for data center-style reliability, but you can also slot it into a well-ventilated server room or a dedicated rack in a larger office. The thing that impressed me when I dug through the spec sheet and a handful of forum threads is the combination of the 2.20 GHz Xeon E52699V4 and 192 GB of DDR4 memory. That CPU gives you 22 physical cores, which translates into a comfortable headroom for running several VMs side by side. Think Windows Server for Active Directory, a Linux host for container workloads, plus a couple of test environments you spin up for client demos. In real use, you'll notice that the cores aren't just there for raw speed. They give you the ability to pin specific VMs to dedicated cores, reducing noisy neighbor effects without needing a separate hypervisor license for each workload. The storage layout is another practical piece. 8 2TB 7.2K SAS drives are pre-installed, wired to an HPE Smart Array P440AR controller. That controller does hardware RAID, and out of the box it defaults to RAID 5. For many SMBs, that's a sweet spot between capacity and redundancy. You get roughly 14 TB usable after parity, which is plenty for a few virtual machines, a shared file store, and some backup snapshots. What matters day-to-day is that the controller handles rebuilds in the background without choking the I/O bandwidth of your active VMs. I've seen people complain that RAID 5 can be a performance bottleneck under heavy write loads, but with the 10 gigabits Ethernet adapter, 2 ports on the 561 FLRT, you have enough network headroom to offload some of that pressure by directing backup traffic to a separate NC or using ISCSI storage pools. Now, let's talk about the power side. Two 800W hot swap PSUs give you redundant power, so a single PSU failure won't take the whole rack down. That's a real-world benefit if you run 24/7 and can't afford a surprise outage. The downside? Those PSUs draw a noticeable amount of idle power, roughly 100W each, even when the server isn't under load. If you're powering a handful of servers in a small office, the electricity bill can add up. It's not a deal breaker, but it's something to factor into your total cost of ownership. Installation is where many first-time buyers stumble. The DL380 comes with rails, but you still need to mount it correctly in a rack, connect the power cords, and then run the initial firmware updates. HPE's ILO 5 remote management interface makes the post-install phase a lot smoother. You can power on the machine, launch a virtual console, and finish OS installation without ever having to be physically present. That's a huge time saver if you're managing the server from a different floor or even a remote office. However, ILO does expect you to have a separate network segment for management traffic. Otherwise, you risk exposing your admin interface to the same network as your production VMs, which isn't best practice. Setting up that dedicated VLAN is a small extra step, but it pays off in security. You should actually consider buying this machine. If you're a small IT team that needs a single box to run multiple critical workloads, say, a domain controller, a mail gateway, a few development sandboxes, and maybe a small database, the DL380 checks the boxes. The 22 cores let you allocate resources per VM without constantly fighting for CPU time, and the 192 GB of RAM means you can give each VM a healthy memory slice. The built-in 10 gigabits NIC is a nice bonus if you already have a 10 GB backbone or are planning to upgrade. It removes the need for an extra network card and cuts down on cabling clutter. On the flip side, if you're a hobbyist looking to run a home lab, you'll probably be overpaying for a lot of that horsepower. A lower-tier Proliant or even a refurbished server with a smaller CPU could handle a couple of VMs just fine, and you'd save a few $1,000s that could go toward better SSD storage or a UPS. Also, if your workloads are heavily storage-intensive, think large video transcoding farms or big data analytics, the 7.2K SAS drives might become a bottleneck. In those scenarios, you'd be better off swapping the SAS drives for enterprise-grade SSDs, but that adds another cost layer that the base configuration doesn't cover. A practical weakness that only becomes apparent after a few weeks of use is the noise level. The server's fans spin,